We are going to begin this morning with new questions about the future of Russian President Vladimir Putin following that shocking but short-lived rebellion. In a dizzying turn of events, an armed rebellion threatened to topple Putin from power. And just as suddenly as it started, it appeared to quickly come to a peaceful end. It began on Friday when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, accused Russia's defense minister of ordering an attack on his soldiers. Now, the Wagner group had been fighting alongside Russian troops. The mercenary leader also accused Russian leadership of launching the war in Ukraine based on lies. His troops abandoned their positions in Ukraine, then marched into Russia. In a televised address, President Putin called Prigozhin's rebellion a stab in the back and treason and betrayal. Then early Saturday, Prigozhin marched his troops into the South Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. Tanks and mercenary troops took over the streets there and eventually took control of a key military headquarters. From there, a column of mercenaries began marching on Moscow. They eventually moved within 120 miles of the Russian capital. Then late Saturday, an abrupt turnaround, with both sides agreeing to a deal that was brokered by the leader of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. Under the terms of the deal, the Kremlin said Prigozhin would not face any charges, but would live in exile in Belarus. A lot to cover, and we have full team coverage this morning, including what it means for Putin's future and the future of the war in Ukraine. Let's begin in Ukraine, in the capital, Kyiv. That's where we find NBC News foreign correspondent Kelly Kobiea. So, Kelly, this has been, as we said, the biggest challenge to Vladimir Putin's power in more than 20 years. In the wake of this deal, what's the message out of the Kremlin this morning and from Russian military leaders? Are we hearing from them?
Well, I think the message specifically from the Russian defense ministry is stability. Today, they released video of the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, visiting troops. Now, we don't know when this video was shot. We don't know where it was shot. But the point is, they released the video showing him doing his job. And it's important because one of the key points raised by Prigozhin, that mercenary leader, was that he wanted Shoigu removed. He wanted him and the military chief of his staff both removed from their positions. That clearly hasn't happened. The other points that are very interesting today are that we have not yet seen or heard from the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, since that 5-minute address to the nation as this rebellion was taking place over the weekend. We also don't know the whereabouts of the man who led this rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin. He was, the Kremlin said, was going to be allowed to go to Belarus. All of his Telegram-affiliated channels have gone silent, his social media channels, where he has been very, very active and very effective at spreading his message. But we now do not know his whereabouts. He was last seen on video, apparently leaving that city, Rostov-on-Don, in the south of Russia, the city that his forces had taken control of. Joe?
You know, and Kelly, what's interesting is over the weekend, video from that captured Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, it actually showed Russians cheering Prigozhin and the Wagner group. Do we know what has been the reaction on the ground in Russia?
Well, I guess it sort of depends where you are. First of all, yes, those crowds were cheering Wagner fighters, and that, remember, is a town that is very, very close to the fight in Ukraine. It's within, I think, 100 kilometers, about 60, 70 miles of the border. So there, in particular, you would find people who are very pro-military, potentially pro-Wagner fighter as well. But it's interesting in hearing from some of the people living in Moscow. Some people described it as shocking, worrying, incomprehensible, confusing. One man said, look, we support Wagner fighters. We support our president. Now we don't know how to reconcile that. So a confusing time, I think, for people in Russia.
And it's also confusing what's going to happen in Ukraine with the war there. What's the reaction where you are in Ukraine to all this internal drama in Russia?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president here, has been talking about this a lot, trying to take advantage of the message anyway, on messaging, saying that this shows that Russia is weak, that bosses in Russia are weak, that there is chaos in Russia, and that the only country that can protect Europe and protect the world right now is Ukraine. So keep supporting Ukraine. On the actual battlefield, what is the impact? We don't really know yet. We don't know how much of an impact Wagner forces were having when all of this took place, and we don't know how many of those fighters are going to join the regular Russian military. So a lot still to be seen in the days, weeks to come, Joe.
All right, Kelly Kobiea in Kyiv. Kelly, thank you so much. The State Department is keeping a close eye on the situation in Russia this morning following a weekend of startling events. Our coverage continues with NBC's Chuck Todd.
Well, hello there, Joe. This week on Meet the Press, Secretary of State Antony Blinken joined me to discuss the chaos that unfolded over the weekend in Russia between that mercenary force, the Wagner Group, and President Putin. Take a look at what he had to say about the rebellion.
What we've seen is extraordinary. Think about it this way. 16 months ago, Russian forces were on the doorstep of Kyiv in Ukraine, believing they would take the capital in a matter of days and erase the country from the map as an independent country. Now, what we've seen is Russia having to defend Moscow, its capital, against mercenaries of its own making. So in and of itself, that's extraordinary. And in so doing, we've also seen rise to the surface profound questions about the very premises for this Russian aggression against Ukraine that Prigozhin surfaced very publicly, as well as a direct challenge to Putin's authority.
What you ended up seeing versus what the intelligence said, how accurate was it?
Well, Chuck, I'm obviously not going to comment on intelligence matters. What I can say is this. I think it's been no secret to many people over many months that these tensions were rising. They were brewing. Prigozhin was already saying some rather extraordinary things about Russia's conduct of the war in Ukraine and going directly at Russia's military leadership. So this was a rising storm, but I'm not going to comment on the intelligence itself. The
dismantling of the Wagner Group. First of all, do you believe it's being dismantled? And if so, what does this mean in Africa and Syria?
Too soon to tell. We'll see if this means that Wagner forces are coming out of Ukraine. I mean, the very fact that over the weekend, Wagner forces were coming out of Ukraine and going into Russia and toward Moscow, in and of itself is extraordinary.
You can see my full interview with him at meetthepress.com. You can also get more Meet the Press right here on NBC News Now, every single weekday at 4 p.m.
All right, Chuck, thank you so much. Let's get more now from Washington with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. So, Monica, Secretary Blinken really has been the main voice on this from the White House. Anything else he said we didn't hear there in that interview with Chuck? And is it significant that we haven't yet heard anything from President Biden?
Well, I think the strategy is really by design, Joe. The administration was watching this so closely. There were so many fast-moving developments. They didn't want to get ahead of anything, and they didn't want to also give any kind of perception that the West was at all involved in what they are referring to as this Russian internal affair. So they're really letting the diplomacy do the talking, and that's why the main chief diplomat for the United States, the Secretary of State, was the one out talking about what he is seeing, but also with this conclusion that they're stressing that it's just too soon to draw any conclusions about what this could mean. Take a listen.
I think we've seen more cracks emerge in the Russian facade. It is too soon to tell exactly where they go and when they get there. But certainly we have all sorts of new questions that Putin is going to have to address in the weeks and months ahead.
Secretary Blinken was working the phones all weekend, talking to critical counterparts. So was Secretary of Defense Austin. And then, of course, President Biden himself. On Saturday, he spoke with the leaders of Germany, France, and the UK to reaffirm support for Ukraine. And then yesterday, he had a call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, which we were expecting, where the two did discuss the events in Russia. That's the way the White House put it. Again, not wanting to put any labels on this until they can get a little bit more information, assess a little bit more. And today is likely the first time we may hear the president speak about this, because over the weekend, when prompted by reporters a couple of times coming and going from Camp David, he declined to answer questions, Joe.
So lots of questions about the future. But, Monica, looking back a little bit, we understand U.S. intelligence did actually know about a potential plot to challenge Moscow's military leaders. I mean, what has NBC News learned about that?
Yeah, and you saw there Secretary Blinken alluding to this rising storm. So obviously they were following it, they say, for weeks and months, this tension between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Russian military specifically. And we had seen that, but in the last 10 days or so, I'm told by U.S. officials, there was an escalatory rise, a significant one that did sort of show that perhaps Prigozhin was planning to mount this challenge. And another sign that U.S. intelligence picked up on that was the fact that he was amassing using weapons and forces. So I'm told that senior officials throughout the administration were briefed about some of that intelligence last Wednesday, and then alarm bells really started to go off internally on Friday. And that's why National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who was supposed to travel to Copenhagen for some talks about Ukraine, scrapped the trip, decided to stay back and monitor the situation so he could keep the president informed. He briefed him all weekend at Camp David. And there were a couple of other signs we saw like that as well. But again, the U.S. very careful not to want to comment on this, as it's still a quite volatile situation.
All right, Monica Alba covering the Biden administration. Monica, thank you so much. Let's dig a little deeper into this with NBC News military analyst Colonel Jack Jacobs. Colonel, always good to have you with us on a story like this. So first of all, just help us understand how unprecedented the events of this past weekend were. Have we seen anything like this in Russia in recent times?
No, not during Putin's reign. He's been in business for 23 years and has had an iron grip on the entire apparatus of the state and the military. But it's not unprecedented in Russia. Russia's history is replete with mutinies of all types and varieties going back all the way back to the 16th century. You see this all the time, however, in autocratic states, because it's the only way that you can have regime change if you get the military behind you. So there's almost always military action and mutinies in situations in which there's going to be, or there's an attempt to have regime change. But what this has done, obviously, is to demonstrate that Putin is not necessarily in total control of the apparatus, and demonstrates the inability of the Russian military to control all of the people under its command, Joe.
Colonel, let's talk about this Wagner group. We've heard a lot about them in the last year. Richard Engel recently did some incredible reporting about their impact and influence in Africa. Help us understand, how powerful is the Wagner group, and are they actually capable of taking on Moscow?
Well, the only way they're going to be able to take on Moscow physically is if they get the rest of the Russian army behind them as they march towards Moscow. That's probably not going to happen, and certainly not anytime soon. But Wagner Group is very, very important to the Russian, the persecution of the Russian mission inside Ukraine. They are probably the only organization in the Russian military that is not totally inept. The Russian army has demonstrated that it tactically, neither tactically nor strategically, can accomplish the mission it had assigned itself. And Wagner itself has been successful only in small places. It was hugely successful in Bakhmut initially, but otherwise has not demonstrated any capability to be any further threat to Russia, Joe.
Colonel, real quickly, how much is everything that we just saw happen in Russia going to impact the war in Ukraine now?
The Russians need Wagner's troops, which is why they've been trying desperately to sign the Wagner's troops into the Russian military. At the end of the day, what is going to happen inside Ukraine is wholly dependent upon Western support for Ukraine on the one hand, and the ability of the Russian military to continue the war. And at the moment, the two people at the top of the military ladder in Russia, Gerasimov and Shoigu, have demonstrated that they are not capable of continuing the war successfully. These are very interesting and difficult times for both sides, Joe.
All right. Colonel Jacobs, always appreciate your expertise, especially on a story like this. Thank you so much. Other news now. In Pennsylvania, the trial for the Tree of Life Synagogue shooter is entering the penalty phase this morning. The jury will now decide whether 50-year-old Robert Bowers gets life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. Earlier this month, that same jury found Bowers guilty of 63 criminal counts, including multiple hate crimes. 11 people were killed in the 2018 shooting, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. It's expected this stage of the trial could take at least 6 weeks. Temperatures are once again soaring in the South today, hitting triple digits for yet another day. This as several states in the Midwest clean up after multiple tornadoes and severe storms tore through the country's midsection. NBC News correspondent Priscilla Thompson joins us now from Houston with more on this. Priscilla, good morning.
Joe, good morning. In just a few hours, this splash pad is going to be filled with kids looking to get some relief from those 100-degree temperatures that we're expected to see here in Houston today. It marks the third week in a row of a historic heat wave that is battering millions across the South. This morning, terrifying tornadoes and sweltering summer heat combining for a brutal 1-2 punch of wild weather.
I don't think we're done climbing on temperature.
Temperatures across the South again topping triple digits, baking some hard-hit communities for the third straight week. Tens of millions facing even more heat alerts in the coming days.
This year, it feels hotter than regular.
In sweltering Southwest Texas, the National Park Service says a 14-year-old boy got sick, lost consciousness, and died while hiking in Big Bend National Park, where temperatures hit nearly 120 degrees. The boy's stepfather rushed to find help and was found dead, officials say, after his car crashed over an embankment. Both deaths remain under investigation. As Southerners hope for relief from the heat, the Midwest is reeling from another round of dangerous twisters.
I think it's going to miss us.
Communities in Minnesota and Indiana hit by multiple tornadoes. Residents forced to take cover.
Slammed the door at the last minute, locked it, ran in and jumped over my little boy in the bathtub.
And in Florida, new video shows the terrifying moments a fast-moving storm swept aboard a Royal Caribbean cruise ship leaving Port Canaveral. Luckily, the cruise line says there were no serious injuries, and the ship set sail as scheduled, as this summer of severe weather shows no signs of slowing down. And Joe, right now there are around 450,000 people throughout the country without power. We aren't seeing any major outages here in Texas, but the power grid operator here has issued a weather watch saying that they are expecting record high demand this week, but they say they do expect they'll be able to meet that demand. But I will tell you right now already it is about 82 degrees out here, so it is very hot already and only getting hotter. I might need to take another pass through the water here in a second. Joe?
Priscilla, that fountain's going to come in handy for you today, and we forgive you if you're a little drenched during your live shots throughout the day. Priscilla Thompson in Houston, thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
So let's get a check on what's next for the South, the Midwest, the rest of the country, and your morning News Now weather forecast. Meteorologist Michelle Grossman's here. Hey, Michelle, good morning.
Hey there, Joe. Great to see you. And we're going to see more of those dangerous temperatures. We're into the third week of seeing triple digits. It's going to go on and on. So no relief in sight. That's one of the big weather stories. The second one, severe weather. We're watching the risk once again today. It looks like it's going to target the East Coast. So this is what radar looks like right now. We have a couple severe storms moving through portions of the Southeast, but it's really the East Coast, the Southeast through the Mid-Atlantic, the Northeast, even parts of New England that will see some showers and some thunderstorms today. So why is this happening? This is the big picture. We have an area of low pressure that's spinning over the Great Lakes. We have a trailing cold front that's coming off that area of low pressure. It's going to move off to the east, and that's going to spark the chance for some really strong storms. We could see winds gusting over 65 miles per hour. Could see some large hail, the chance of a few tornadoes, and really heavy downpours. We saw a couple of those over the weekend. Then as we look towards the south, we have an area of high pressure. Think of it like a heat pump. It's just pumping in that really warm air, that dangerous heat, and also some moisture. So that's what we're looking at in the south. Once you factor in that humidity, that's where we start to feel like 110, 120. So we have that severe threat. We have the dangerous heat once again. Now with the severe threat, we're looking at enhanced risk. That's pretty high on the scale. So that is where it's most likely where we're going to get those strong storms from Philadelphia to D.C., Richmond, also Raleigh. 58 million Americans under the gun for some severe weather. We're looking at the chance for those really gusty winds and also hail. Where you see this blue hatching area, that's where we're going to see the chance for some really gusty winds and heavy downpours. This could lead to flash flooding because we could locally see 4 inches. Where you see those brighter colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, that's where we're looking at the chance for some really heavy rainfall. We could see some flooded roads, the creeks, the streams could rise as well. And we're going to see those summer-like downpours with 2 inches per hour or more. So here's the futurecast as we go throughout time. We mentioned today, then tomorrow, that cold front's going to move way too slow off to the east. So we're going to keep the shower threat in chance. Could see some storms as well, and also the risk for some really heavy downpours. That's Tuesday. Wednesday, notice that area of low pressure kind of lingering over the northeast. So now scattered storms targeting parts of New England. But we'll mention the heat alerts too, because we're looking at 33 million people impacted by these heat alerts from the southwest all the way to portions of the Tennessee Valley. And we're talking triple digits. Joe, you've been working the past 3 weeks where we just talk about it every single day. say. We are stuck in it. It doesn't stop. And that's where it gets super dangerous on the body.
Yeah, and people just have to do their best to stay inside, get that air conditioning, drink plenty of fluids.
And hope you have that.
Exactly. We have not turned on our air conditioner yet, but this morning I was finally tempted because it's so humid here. Oh,
and you
my
can
goodness.
feel it.
You can just,
Yeah. I can't believe you have not turned it on yet.
I know. We've done so good so far, but it's about to change. All right, Michelle, thanks so much.
Sure.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.